The year was 1863, and Pennsylvania was torn by the wounds of war. Fields carried the scent of smoke and decay, and small towns whispered about sons who never returned from the battlefield. Yet amid the ruin rose a building that seemed untouched by death. Perched on a hill above the river stood the new sanatorium, its walls white as chalk, its windows gleaming in the sun. People called it a house of mercy, a place where broken soldiers and troubled minds could find peace. Families who carried grief in their eyes brought loved ones there with trembling hands, believing the gates promised rest and cure. They clutched at hope, blind to what waited inside. The white paint on the walls was chosen carefully, not simply for beauty but for deception. White meant purity, white meant heaven, white meant clean hands in an unclean time. Mothers who left their children there whispered prayers of relief as they kissed their foreheads, thinking this place was safe. But inside those walls, the brightness concealed shadows. Every corner had been measured, every hallway planned, not only for comfort but for control. The air smelled of chalk and camphor, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Silence wrapped the building, broken only by the muffled moans of those hidden away. The sanatorium presented itself as a sanctuary, yet its calm was unnatural, too still, as if something alive was holding its breath beneath the floors. The man behind it was Dr. Horace Blackwell, a physician celebrated in Philadelphia circles and praised in speeches for his service to wounded soldiers. His reputation made the sanatorium's existence unquestionable, its funding secure. He spoke softly, with the patience of a man devoted to care, and nobles believed his every word. Yet beneath his steady smile lived a mind with different hungers. He did not see the sanatorium as a refuge, but as a theater, where human suffering could be studied and shaped into ritual. He viewed pain not as an accident of the body, but as a resource, something to be harvested carefully, preserved, and catalogued. He dreamed of suffering not as tragedy, but as order, a science that could be refined to purity. Patients arrived broken, many from the war. Men trembled with fever dreams of battlefields, women sobbed from unseen terrors, and children clung to dolls as if they could stop time. Blackwell greeted each with a kindness that felt genuine, promising treatment, promising rest, promising that their torment would finally end. He wrote their names in careful script, not only for record but for possession. He believed that once a name was entered into his books, the person no longer belonged to their family, their church, or even to God. They belonged to him, and through him to the earth itself. The first weeks in the sanatorium lulled families into trust. Visitors saw quiet gardens and clean linens, and they left reassured. But the patients saw something else. They saw that the halls never echoed with laughter, that the nurses' eyes never lingered long enough to show warmth. They saw the locked doors at the end of the corridors, the ones no visitor was allowed to enter. They heard strange sounds in the night, the scrape of metal against stone, the dragging of something heavy, the muffled cries that ended too suddenly. Death in the sanatorium did not come as the families imagined. It was not a gentle passing in sleep, not a release from pain. Blackwell saw death as an instrument, a process to be conducted with precision. He believed madness could be drawn out of a person like poison, but only if they were pushed to the edge of their endurance. He began to test how far that edge could be stretched. Patients disappeared after simple treatments, their beds stripped bare, their names quietly crossed from the books. Staff were instructed to tell families that recovery was slow, that letters would be sent soon. But no letters ever came. Those who vanished were not lost to medicine's failure, but to Blackwell's method. He buried some patients alive beneath the gardens, believing the earth drank their fear and purified the soil. Others were sealed in chambers where silence swallowed their screams, leaving behind only faint scratches on stone walls. Each experiment was not random cruelty but deliberate design, part of a pattern known only to him. He believed every act of torment left an imprint, a mark on the world stronger than any sermon or law. And he saw himself not as a murderer but as a man chosen to reveal truths too dark for ordinary eyes. The white walls stood gleaming, while within them voices were smothered. Families continued to deliver their sick, blessing Blackwell's hands for what they thought was healing. They never saw the nails clawed down the inside of coffins or the broken bodies hidden beneath fresh soil. The sanatorium grew, its reputation spreading, its beds filling with the desperate. Behind its gates, mercy was only a word. In truth, the white walls were built to contain horror, a fortress not of healing but of silence. And silence was exactly what Dr. Horace Blackwell required, for in silence his work could grow. Dr. Horace Blackwell carried himself as a man of reason, the kind whose presence quieted a room without raising his voice. His reputation had been built on the battlefields of Antietam and Gettysburg, where he stitched torn flesh and calmed soldiers writhing in agony. Letters praising his service had reached the desk of Abraham Lincoln himself, and the president's kind words were repeated in every newspaper that printed Blackwell's name. To the public, he was a healer, a patriot, a man of science who restored broken lives. Yet beneath the layer of honor lay a mind that had grown addicted to suffering. The battlefield had not taught him compassion. It had shown him that pain could be shaped, measured, and prolonged with a surgeon's precision. What haunted Blackwell was not the memory of saving lives, but the moments when he had watched men die slowly under his knife, unable to scream because of the cloth stuffed into their mouths. He had seen that terror transformed them, stripped them of all identity, leaving behind something raw and unguarded. He became obsessed with that state, believing it revealed truths that healthy men kept buried. To him, the battlefield was not horror but revelation, and he returned from war determined to recreate those moments in controlled settings. The sanatorium gave him the perfect stage, free from interference, supported by patrons too blinded by their admiration to ask questions. His vision grew from a simple conviction. Madness was not random. It was contagion, and only through sacrifice could the balance be restored. He believed every cure required the destruction of another body, that the preservation of one mind demanded the unraveling of another. To Blackwell, healing was not mercy but exchange, a ledger that demanded blood on one side and silence on the other. Patience became his currency, their lives traded like weights on a scale no one else could see. He developed rituals disguised as treatments. A man who entered trembling from night terrors might be given a sedative and led gently into a chamber where the air was slowly drained. His panic was catalogued, his heart measured, his death timed to the second. Blackwell noted how the man's last breath scraped the throat, how his body convulsed against restraint, and he wrote it all as if it were data. Later, when another patient was cured after weeks of torment, Blackwell credited the earlier sacrifice, claiming survival had been purchased. Families praised him for saving one child without ever knowing another had been buried alive beneath the gardens. He masked his cruelty in words that sounded holy. He spoke of purity, of silence, of sacrifice. To the nurses, he said that silence was the only true sign of progress, that a patient who screamed was still clinging to illness. Many of them obeyed without question, believing his calm authority was wisdom. He taught them that madness was noise, and that every act leading to silence was an act of medicine. Over time, the staff grew numb to the bruises, the broken wrists, the hollow eyes of those strapped to beds. They convinced themselves they were not witnessing murder but miracles, all because Blackwell never raised his hand in anger. He inflicted cruelty with the same serenity he used to write prescriptions, as if pain were simply another dose carefully measured. At night he walked the empty halls with a lantern, stopping outside the locked doors where the worst screams had echoed hours before. He pressed his ear to the wood, not to hear but to savor the absence of sound. The silence was his triumph, the proof that his methods had taken root. In his journals he wrote of silence as if it were a living thing, a spirit that demanded feeding, and he believed the sanatorium existed only to provide that nourishment. Each death, each broken body was an offering to silence itself. His obsession deepened until he began to see patients as symbols rather than people. A child who stuttered was not a boy, but a vessel to be emptied of imperfection. A mother suffering from melancholy was not a woman, but a stone to be ground down until her spirit dissolved. He convinced himself that each ritual, no matter how cruel, lifted a veil from the world, pushing humanity closer to purity. To Blackwell, killing was not cruelty but necessity, and the sanatorium was not a prison but a temple where he served as priest. Those who survived his treatments did so with scars deeper than flesh. Their minds were fractured, their eyes hollow, their bodies bent by days of restraint. Yet Blackwell paraded them before visiting families as proof of progress. He spoke of them as cured, pointing to their silence as evidence, when in truth they had been emptied of everything that made them human. Families wept with gratitude, never realizing they were staring at shells carved by deliberate torment. The sanatorium grew in fame as these successes multiplied. Patrons offered more money, more beds were built, and more desperate families lined at the gates. Blackwell's reputation soared, his name spoken with reverence in political halls. Yet beneath the praise, in the locked rooms and hidden chambers, his true vision flourished. A world where survival was purchased with hidden graves, and where silence was not peace but the echo of countless suffocated voices. The white walls remained bright, families continued to arrive, and Blackwell's calm face hid the truth. His vision was no longer medicine. It was ritual, it was hunger, and it demanded more lives with every passing day. Beneath the whitewashed corridors of the sanatorium lay a level no visitor ever saw. It was not listed on maps, not spoken of in staff meetings, and not included in the architectural records. It was a space designed with intention, carved out in silence, brick by brick, under Blackwell's private supervision. Patients were told it was storage. Nurses were told never to enter. Only a select few orderlies, bound by fear and by the doctor's promises of favor, were allowed to step through the iron door at the end of the lowest hall. Behind it waited the soundproof chambers, a hidden heart that beat beneath the building, pulsing with suffering no ear outside would ever hear. The walls were thick, padded with layers of cloth and mortar. Iron bolts locked the doors tight, sealing in the air. Narrow vents twisted upward into hidden shafts designed not to release sound but to trap it. No matter how loud the screams rose, they never passed through the walls. It was a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as if the cries were swallowed by something alive. For Blackwell, this was perfection. He believed silence was not the absence of life but the proof of control, and these chambers were his most careful instruments. Patients disappeared after what seemed like simple treatments. A man scheduled for calming baths was escorted down a side hall and never returned. A child promised a soothing sleep tonic was carried into the chamber in the doctor's arms and never seen again. Families were told these patients had been moved to other wings or that their recovery required isolation. The lies slipped easily from the nurse's lips because the doctor's authority left no room for doubt. But the truth was simpler and darker. Once a patient passed through the iron door, their fate was sealed. Inside, Blackwell conducted what he called his trials. He strapped patients upright against cold stone, their arms extended as if crucified, their chests wrapped in leather belts that cut into the skin. He watched them shiver in the dim light, their mouths gagged with cloth to prevent biting through their tongues. Once secured, he introduced suffering slowly, not with sudden violence but with steady cruelty. Some were kept awake for days under a dripping pipe, each drop landing on their foreheads until their sanity fractured. Others were locked in absolute darkness, their restraints removed so they could wander blindly, slamming into padded walls until exhaustion dropped them to the floor. He documented how long it took for them to forget their own names, for sobs to turn into wordless moans, for voices to fade into silence. The most methodical of his practices involved deprivation. He would reduce the air in the chambers through hidden valves, never enough to kill immediately, but enough to make every breath burn. He measured how long it took for panic to overcome reason, how quickly the body betrayed itself when starved of oxygen. He claimed these studies proved his theory, that silence was not only a symptom of treatment but its final goal. To him, every death was not failure but transformation, the patient stripped of madness and delivered into pure quiet. The victim's ends were devastating, not quick but drawn out, every detail calculated. One woman, once lively with songs, clawed her nails down to the bone against padded walls as the chamber smothered her cries. A soldier who survived the war only to be delivered to Blackwell choked on his own breath for hours, each gasp echoing in the doctor's notes. When they finally went still, Blackwell stood over them in calm reflection, convinced he had harvested another fragment of truth. He ordered their bodies removed quickly, wrapped in plain sheets and taken to the earth before dawn. By daylight, the chambers were washed clean, prepared for the next patient. What made these deaths unbearable was not only their cruelty but their invisibility. The world above remained untouched, its corridors shining, its gardens tended. Families continued to trust the doctor, unaware that beneath their feet their loved ones were being dismantled in silence. Blackwell knew the power of this contrast. The chambers existed not only to destroy but to hide destruction, to create a divide between the mercy shown in the open and the torment buried underground. It was a division that mirrored his own mind, calm, composed, saintly on the surface, yet rotting with obsession below. The toll of these rituals seeped into the staff as well. Some orderlies avoided the chambers at all costs, feigning illness rather than face the screams that no one else would ever hear. Others grew hardened, their consciences dulled by routine, convincing themselves that silence meant progress. Yet even they sometimes woke at night in terror, certain they could hear muffled voices clawing up through the floors, begging to be remembered. For Blackwell, none of this was madness. It was order, ritual, science carried out with devotion. The soundproof chambers were not prisons in his eyes, but altars. Each scream that vanished into their walls was, to him, another offering swallowed by silence. And as the chambers filled with unseen suffering, the sanatorium above grew in reputation, praised for its calm, for its quiet, for its mercy. The white walls above gleamed brighter with every hidden death below, and the silence became the foundation on which Blackwell built the rest of his work. The earth had always held a strange fascination for Dr. Horace Blackwell. On the battlefield, he had seen men fall into the mud, their faces pressed against the soil as life drained away, and he had noticed how quiet their eyes became in those final moments. To him, it was not simply death but a transaction, as though the earth itself absorbed their madness and despair, pulling it deep into the ground where no one would hear it again. This belief grew into obsession, and in the hidden routines of the sanatorium he began shaping rituals that would feed the soil directly. He told himself it was not cruelty but purification, that if the insane were offered alive to the earth, their sickness would be swallowed and the world above would grow calmer in return. The practice was not haphazard, it was precise, calculated, rehearsed. Blackwell designed coffins of unpainted wood, plain boxes with thin air tubes running from the inside up to the surface of the ground. These tubes did not promise life. They promised only prolongation, a trickle of breath that stretched death into a long, suffocating ritual. Patients selected for burial were often the ones deemed too restless, too loud, too resistant to silence. They were sedated just enough to allow transport, then lowered into the waiting coffin under the cold eye of the doctor. Once the lid closed, the nails hammered in. The ritual began. The coffin was lowered into a shallow pit and covered in soil. The tube left protruding from the ground like a root gasping for air. Inside, terror bloomed slowly. The patients awoke to crushing darkness, their limbs restricted, their lungs heaving against the narrow stream of air. At first they screamed, pounding the wood, their cries muffled by soil and distance. But hours passed and panic shifted into desperate clawing, fingernails tearing into wood until they split and bled. The tube gave them hope, a cruel drip of oxygen that refused to kill them quickly. They breathed, but every breath was a struggle, every inhale tighter than the last. They tasted earth in their throats, felt the weight of soil pressing closer with every shallow gasp. Blackwell recorded it all, crouched above the burial sites with his notebook, pressing his ear to the ground as if listening to the heartbeat of the world itself. He timed their decline carefully. He noted the changes in rhythm, the weakening of fists against the lid, the shift from sharp gasps to rattling sighs. He wrote of the way the tube whistled when the patient's lungs fought for air, how the sound slowed like a dying clock before ceasing entirely. He called these moments absorptions, and in his mind each one cleansed the sanatorium, removing madness not just from a body but from the air itself. When silence finally settled, he would mark the page with a line and whisper that the earth had accepted its gift. The deaths were devastating, not only in their cruelty but in the loneliness they imposed. No one witnessed them except the doctor and his chosen assistants, who buried the boxes and stood guard until stillness replaced struggle. Those buried alive were denied even the small dignity of being remembered, their names erased from records, their families told they had simply faded away under treatment. Their graves were unmarked, scattered across the gardens and fields, their bodies hidden beneath flowers that bloomed unnaturally bright in the months that followed. The beauty of the grounds became a mask, concealing beneath its soil the horror of dozens of slow, suffocating deaths. For Blackwell, these rituals deepened his conviction. He began to believe that the sanatorium itself depended on these sacrifices, that the building's serenity came not from his treatments, but from the earth's hunger being fed. He walked the gardens in silence, his hands folded behind his back, imagining that the soil whispered thanks beneath his shoes. He grew convinced that the land would wither if the offering stopped, that madness would seep back into the walls if the coffins no longer filled the ground. This belief drove him further, pushing him to expand the burials, to demand more bodies, more silence, more offerings to keep his sanctuary alive. The psychological toll on the staff who helped him was corrosive. Some began to drink heavily, unable to silence the image of dirt raining down on living faces. Others hardened into cruelty, mocking the muffled sounds from below, convincing themselves that the patients deserved their fate. A few vanished quietly, dismissed or perhaps absorbed into the same soil they had once helped shovel. Blackwell tolerated no weakness, reminding them that the work was sacred, that purity required sacrifice. His calm voice, steady and unshaken, bent their wills until they obeyed even as their consciences rotted. The patients left alive began to sense what was happening. They whispered to each other about the ones who never returned from the gardens. about the hollow patches of soil where flowers grew too quickly, too red. Some refused to walk near the edges of the grounds, convinced they could hear faint scratching beneath their feet. The fear spread like infection, making them quieter, more submissive, exactly as Blackwell intended. Terror itself became his ally, controlling the living as effectively as the coffins controlled the dying. The ritual of the breathless earth was not an act of madness, but of design, rooted in the doctor's unwavering belief that silence could be engineered through suffering. Every buried patient became another line in his ledger, another step toward a world he envisioned where noise, chaos, and despair were swallowed whole. The sanatorium above remained bright, families continued to arrive, and the grounds bloomed with deceptive beauty. Yet under the soil, the earth choked on secrets, and Blackwell's vision pressed deeper into horror, convinced that purity required nothing less than the breath of the buried. The sanatorium's gardens were praised by visitors as a vision of healing. Neatly trimmed hedges lined winding paths, beds of flowers swayed gently in the wind, and a fountain trickled with the illusion of peace. To families who came seeking reassurance, this was the proof that their loved ones were in a place of recovery. They saw patients seated quietly in rows, backs straight in iron-rooted chairs, faces lifted toward the sky as if basking in nature's grace. The sight calmed their fears. They left believing their relatives were receiving sunlight and fresh air as any doctor might prescribe. What they did not see was how those chairs were built not for comfort but for bondage, how every angle of iron was bent to force bodies into unnatural positions, and how the silence of the garden came not from peace but from suffering too deep to resist. Blackwell had created the garden as his next step in treatment. He believed hysteria was a fire that needed to be broken by elements stronger than the human will. Sun, rain, wind, and time would wear down the flames, but only if the body was denied escape. He designed the chairs with heavy bases bolted deep into the earth so they could not be moved. Leather straps bound wrists and ankles, while curved bars pressed the spine backward, arching it until every breath was a sharp reminder of restraint. Patients were forced to sit this way for hours, then days, until their muscles trembled and their joints screamed. To Blackwell, every shudder, every cry was proof of the body surrendering its madness to the discipline of the garden. The cruelty of the method revealed itself slowly. At first, patients begged to be released, their voices sharp, their eyes wild. But the sun burned their faces until blisters swelled across their skin. The rain soaked their clothes, chilling their bones until shivers set deep. Insects found the open sores left by straps rubbing raw against wrists, crawling into wounds, feeding silently while orderlies took notes on the progress. Over time, resistance faded, the once frantic cries dulled to murmurs, then to silence. Blackwell pointed to this quiet as proof that the treatment worked. He recorded how long it took before each patient ceased to resist, believing the moment of stillness marked the death of hysteria inside them. Some never returned from the garden alive, their heads slumped forward, their mouths slack, their skin blistered and broken from days of exposure. Orderlies carried them away under nightfall, whispering to one another in fear as they dragged the bodies down hidden paths. Others survived but were changed beyond recognition. Their backs remained twisted, their wrists scarred with deep grooves, their eyes hollowed by the memory of restraint. When families visited, Blackwell paraded these survivors as evidence of his genius. He spoke of how the garden had given them serenity, how the silence of their posture showed cure. Families too desperate to question wept with relief, blind to the truth that they were looking at the ruins of human beings emptied of their will. The garden became a place of dread for the patients still within the sanatorium. They whispered of it at night, saying the chairs were waiting, that once a body was strapped in, the garden would claim it like the earth beneath had claimed the buried. They grew quieter, more obedient, trying to avoid the doctor's eye, terrified that the next morning they would be led out into the open air. Their fear only strengthened Blackwell's belief that the method worked. He called it the discipline of nature, convinced that the elements themselves acted as accomplices in purifying madness. What made the garden more monstrous was the deception it offered. Locals walking past the gates saw rows of patients sitting calmly beneath the trees, appearing like silent monks in prayer. They believed the sanatorium's reputation for peace, repeating to neighbors that it was a place where troubled souls found harmony with the world. No one imagined that beneath the quiet postures lay bodies broken by sun, rain, and restraint. The garden's beauty was a mask, and its silence was not born of tranquility but of pain too deep for words. For Blackwell, this deception was part of the ritual. He relished the idea that the garden held two faces, one for the world above, one for the suffering beneath. He walked the rows with hands clasped behind his back, pausing to study a patient's sunburned skin or the tremor of a muscle pulling against leather. He saw not torment but progress, not death but purification. In his notes he wrote that the garden was a living sermon, that nature itself preached silence when given the right instruments. To him, every scar was scripture, every broken voice a hymn. The white walls of the sanatorium rose beyond the hedges, still gleaming, still praised. Families continued to deliver their sick, never doubting the calm beauty of the grounds. Yet for those who sat strapped in the iron-rooted chairs, time stretched into endless torment, their bodies broken by the garden's discipline until silence was all that remained. The chamber was small, almost featureless, its stone walls bare except for the hooks where instruments hung. A lantern burned dimly, its glow catching the outlines of plaster molds stacked neatly on shelves. To a visitor, they might have looked like simple crafts, half-finished masks waiting to be painted. But to Dr. Horace Blackwell, they were the faces of a new ritual, one he called purification. Each mask had been molded to fit the contours of a patient's head, pressed tight against skin and bone until it became impossible to distinguish where flesh ended and plaster began. The masks were not decorations, they were prisons. Blackwell's theory was that madness lived not in the mind but in the skin, the eyes, the pores through which the world entered. He believed impurity seeped into people through sight and breath, and that to purify them one must seal off the senses and strip away the poisoned flesh. The chamber became his laboratory and the plaster masks his tools. Patients were led inside under the guise of treatment. They were told it would calm their nerves, that the mask would shield them from the chaos of the world. For a moment they believed, seeing only a harmless covering. But once the clamps snapped shut along the edges, belief gave way to terror. The masks were molded so tightly that mouths and eyes disappeared into smooth white surfaces. Small holes had been drilled at deliberate angles, one for a reed through which the victim drew thin breaths, two more above the eyes where Blackwell poured his mixtures. The reed gave just enough air to prevent quick death, prolonging life while the mask transformed suffering into silence. Blackwell prepared vials of chemicals, lime solutions, acidic tinctures, compounds that burned slowly when dripped into flesh. He tested them drop by drop, watching through narrow slits as skin bubbled, as tears clouded the hidden eyes, as muffled cries rattled against plaster but went nowhere. The deaths were not sudden. They unfolded in stages, each one meticulously recorded in the doctor's notes. First came panic, the patient clawing at the edges of the mask, fingers slipping on plaster as they tried to tear it free. Then exhaustion, the body slumping, the reed whistling as shallow breaths grew ragged. Then the collapse, skin peeling from cheeks, eyes turning to cloudy film, voices breaking into hoarse sobs before fading into silence. The plaster held everything in, transforming faces into hollow shells that betrayed nothing to the world outside. Blackwell often left the chamber during these final hours, returning later to find only stillness. He would remove the mask and study what remained, touching the burned flesh with clinical detachment. To him, it was proof that impurity had been purged. He referred to those who underwent the mask ritual not as patients but as vessels. He wrote that once sealed, they ceased to be individuals and became forms waiting to be emptied. Their silence was their offering, their ruined faces the mark of completion. Blackwell displayed some of the masks on the shelves, their insides stained with remnants of blood and skin as if to remind himself of the progress he had made. He called the chamber his gallery of hollow faces, a place where human imperfection was stripped away and purity was revealed. The psychological toll on those who survived the masks was catastrophic. Some were released after hours of torment, their skin raw, their sight dimmed, their minds fractured by the suffocating isolation. They no longer spoke in coherent words, only in whispers and shivers, as though their voices had been sealed inside the plaster and left behind. Blackwell paraded these survivors before visiting patrons, describing their silence as evidence of cure. Families saw their loved ones reduced to husks, but his steady explanations, his calm confidence, smothered their doubts. They wanted to believe, and belief made them complicit. The orderlies who assisted in the chamber carried its memory like a curse. Some vomited after the sessions, shaken by the smell of burning flesh trapped within the plaster. Others hardened into obedience, convincing themselves that the doctor knew best. A few disappeared altogether, their absence explained by dismissal or transfer, but whispers suggested otherwise, that they had been made into vessels themselves when their loyalty wavered. No one dared to ask too loudly. Blackwell's obsession with the chamber grew until he began to see it as sacred. He wrote that the hollow faces were mirrors of the human soul, stripped of noise and vanity. He spoke to the masks as though they answered him, whispering that they had carried madness out of the body and into the void. To him, the chamber was not cruelty but revelation, a sanctuary where silence was sculpted with plaster and fire. The sanatorium above continued to gleam, its gardens in bloom, its halls quiet. Families walked past unaware that beneath their feet loved ones were suffocating inside plaster shells, their final moments dripping away in chemical burns. The contrast was deliberate. Blackwell thrived on it, savoring the deception as part of the ritual. He knew that every calm smile he gave, every reassuring word was strengthened by the hidden horror below. The more innocent he appeared, the more power the chamber held. In time, the masks became symbols for him, not of cruelty but of purity. He believed that someday all mankind would need such purification, that the noise of the world would demand silence on a greater scale. Until then, he fed the chamber one life at a time, each death recorded, each face hollowed, each voice smothered until nothing remained but silence. The sanatorium's dining hall was not often used, its long tables usually left covered in white sheets, its chandeliers dimmed in silence. But on certain nights the building transformed, its windows glowing like lanterns on the hill, the smell of roasted meats drifting out into the cold air. These nights were reserved for the benefactors, the men whose gold and power kept the institution alive. They arrived in carriages lined with velvet, their boots polished, their wives cloaked in jewels, their names carried through Pennsylvania with the weight of law. Among them sat Senator Edgar Cowan, a man who had the president's ear, and who spoke often of reform and progress. He, like the others, believed his money was feeding a noble cause. He had no idea how literal that belief would prove to be. Dr. Horace Blackwell greeted them with calm authority, his coat spotless, his manner humble yet commanding. He poured wine into crystal glasses, offered thanks for their generosity, and assured them that the sanatorium was a beacon in a time of war and uncertainty. The guests nodded, pleased with themselves, eager to see the fruits of their investment. They wanted proof of progress, and Blackwell, ever the careful showman, gave it to them. After the meal, as candlelight flickered against portraits of long-dead nobles, Blackwell led the patrons on a tour. He spoke of science, of innovation, of methods that would end hysteria and madness. He brought them down long corridors where the air was unnaturally still. Behind locked doors, patients waited, already restrained, prepared for display as though they were actors on a stage. The benefactors were guided into chambers where bodies sat in iron-rooted chairs, spines bent into painful arches, lips trembling but no words escaping. To the patrons they appeared serene, almost saintly, their silence mistaken for cure. Blackwell spoke softly, praising the effectiveness of restraint, explaining that madness had been subdued. The guests smiled, murmuring approval, blind to the agony staring at them through hollow eyes. In another room he revealed a patient fresh from the chamber of hollow faces. The plaster mask had been removed, but the skin beneath was raw, blistered, half-healed. The man's gaze was vacant, his lips torn and silent. Blackwell gestured toward him as if unveiling a painting, describing the silence as a triumph of treatment, proof that even the most broken mind could be brought to stillness. The benefactors leaned closer, some grimacing, others fascinated, but none willing to challenge the doctor's word. His confidence wrapped the horror in the language of science, and their wealth made them complicit. They had paid for this progress, and so they convinced themselves it must be good. What they did not see was the suffering that began once the doors closed. They did not hear the muffled cries that rose after they departed, nor the frantic scratching of nails against stone, nor the way orderlies carried bodies out in the dark, leaving rooms empty for the next display. To the benefactors, the tour ended with glasses of brandy by the fire, their egos stroked by Blackwell's gratitude. They toasted one another, praising their role in shaping the future of medicine. Their laughter filled the hall while, below their feet, patients suffocated in silence. For Blackwell, these evenings were more than theater. They were rituals of power, moments when cruelty was not hidden but dressed in silk and candlelight. He relished the way suffering could be displayed as art, the way agony could be applauded by men who would never dare soil their hands. The guests became part of the ritual, not by inflicting pain but by endorsing it, their nods and smiles binding them to the silence he worshipped. He recorded these nights in his journals with satisfaction, noting that even the most powerful men could be bent into accomplices when cruelty was cloaked in reason. Senator Cowan left one evening remarking that the sanatorium was a model for the future, that such discipline could change the course of the nation's care for the insane. His words carried weight in Washington, his praise echoing through halls of power, spreading Blackwell's reputation further. The doctor's vision grew stronger with every toast, every approving glance, every coin placed into the coffers. The white walls above gleamed brighter, the gardens bloomed richer, and the chambers below filled with more bodies. The benefactors never realized that their dinners fed more than their pride. They fed the silence, the same silence that buried patients alive, that burned faces under plaster, that broke bodies beneath the sun. They left the hilltop with full bellies and light hearts, blind to the suffering their wealth had purchased. Blackwell stood in the doorway watching their carriages disappear, his calm smile never wavering, his mind already calculating the next display. For him, the dinner was not an ending but a promise. The powerful had nodded, the powerful had smiled, and in their silence he found permission to continue. The white walls of the sanatorium had been built to keep silence contained, yet silence is never perfect. It bends, it cracks, and in those cracks voices find ways to crawl through. For months the surviving patients had watched their fellows disappear, some taken to the gardens and never returning, others sealed in chambers from which no sound emerged. They whispered to one another in the shadows, trembling as they traded fragments of truth. At night, when the orderlies had gone, fingernails carved names into stone, rough etchings left on the edges of cots and along the mortar between bricks. These marks were desperate acts of resistance, an attempt to preserve memory before it was swallowed whole. Some were little more than initials scratched by bleeding fingers. Others carried full names and dates, grim declarations that the forgotten had once lived. Blackwell did not notice at first, for his gaze was always turned to the rituals of silence, not the whispers of survival. But the patients saw the etchings as proof they were not yet erased, that even if their bodies were buried, their names would claw upward through the walls. They clung to this fragile hope, and slowly it hardened into defiance. They began to share what little they knew of the sanatorium's design, which orderlies slept heavy, which locks were weakest, which corridors connected to doors that sometimes opened with poorly fitted keys. Each secret was a seed planted in minds long stripped of freedom, and from those seeds grew the thought that they might fight. The breaking point came one rain-soaked night when a woman strapped in the garden of restraints managed to twist her swollen wrist free from the leather. She staggered back into the hall, dripping with blood and rain, her body warped from weeks of torment. Others saw her and felt something shift inside them. If she could break free even for a moment, then perhaps the rest could too. Whispers turned to action. When the lamps dimmed, when the staff grew weary from drink, restraints were tested again and again until straps snapped and bolts gave way. The uprising began not with shouts, but with a flood of desperate bodies pouring through the hallways. Patients moved like shadows, some dragging chains, others limping from broken limbs, all united by terror sharpened into rage. They clawed at doors, tore at curtains, and shattered glass with bleeding fists. Their voices rose in raw cries that had been buried too long. For the first time, the sanatorium's silence fractured, the walls trembling under a chorus of the forgotten demanding to be seen. But the uprising was doomed from the start. The orderlies were stronger, their clubs heavy, their fear quickly replaced by cruelty. Patients were beaten back into submission, their screams drowned beneath the sound of cracking bone. Some tried to run into the gardens, but there the earth swallowed them again, the same earth that had taken so many before. A few managed to reach the outer gates, but rain had softened the ground, and they slipped and fell, dragged back inside by men who struck them until they stopped moving. The uprising collapsed in less than an hour, leaving only blood smeared across walls and broken bodies scattered through the corridors. Yet even in failure, the rebellion left its mark. Some patients had carved their names deeper than before, leaving unmistakable proof of their existence. Scratched into stone, etched into wooden beams, their words became stains the staff could not fully erase. Orderlies tried to scrub them away, but the marks lingered, scars in the building itself. And when visiting eyes wandered the halls in the weeks that followed, a few noticed these strange inscriptions, quiet questions forming in their minds. Blackwell recorded the uprising with calm detachment, calling it a predictable outburst of the diseased. He wrote that hysteria always sought to spread, and that order had rightly crushed it. Yet beneath his steady handwriting lay the faint tremor of something he could not fully ignore. The silence he worshipped had been broken, and though he restored it with blood, he knew it could never again be whole. The whispers had escaped into the world, carried by surviving patients who now lay motionless in their beds, but whose eyes told stories no strap could silence. Evidence began to trickle beyond the walls. A nurse dismissed for disobedience carried rumors into town. speaking of etched names and muffled screams. Families noticed bruises on the bodies of those returned to them in death, their grief sharpening into suspicion. Local priests began to question why the gardens bloomed so brightly while so many patients vanished without burial rites. The cracks widened, and into them poured the first glimmers of truth. The uprising had not freed the patients, but it had revealed the hidden rot. For the first time, the sanatorium's silence could not contain the weight of its secrets, and though Blackwell tightened his grip, though he assured his benefactors that nothing was amiss, he could not stop what had begun. The forgotten had spoken, and their voices, etched into walls and carried into whispers beyond the gates, would not fade again. The rains came without warning in the spring of 1868, a storm that seemed to linger unnaturally over the hill where the sanatorium stood. Day after day, sheets of water lashed against its walls, turning the gardens into rivers of mud and the surrounding fields into shallow lakes. The ground, once so carefully tended, began to sag and break apart under the weight of water. Roots loosened, soil collapsed, and the earth that had held so many secrets could no longer contain them. The Garden of Beauty became a graveyard unearthed, and what emerged from the soil was not flowers, but truth. The first coffin was found when a tree toppled in the night, its roots dragging up a crude wooden box buried shallow beneath the mud. The coffin was split, the lid clawed from within. Inside lay a skeleton still wrapped in remnants of cloth, the bones of fingers broken and bent from frantic scratching. Within hours, more coffins surfaced, dozens pushed up by the flood, their lids scarred with desperate marks. Some still held bodies curled tight as if trying to shrink from the crushing earth, their skulls tilted back in the eternal gasp of suffocation. Families who had been told their loved ones had peacefully faded in treatment stood over the remains, choking on grief too sharp to speak. The storm had not just broken the soil, it had broken the silence. Word spread quickly through the town, carried by whispers that grew into shouts. Journalists arrived, their boots sinking into the mud as they scribbled notes, their faces pale at the sight of coffins littered across the gardens like driftwood after a flood. Church leaders walked among the bodies, muttering prayers as their hands shook, unable to reconcile sermons of mercy with the evidence of deliberate burial. Mothers fainted when they recognized scraps of familiar clothing. Fathers wept openly, gripping bones that once belonged to sons and daughters they had trusted to the care of Dr. Blackwell. The sanatorium, once praised as a place of healing, now reeked of betrayal. Reporters wrote of the scratches, the broken nails, the faces frozen in agony. They described the reed-like tubes still protruding from some coffins, cruel instruments of prolonged death. Words like purification and treatment became twisted into mockeries, their meaning poisoned by the reality unearthed. The public, once eager to praise Blackwell's methods, turned to rage. They demanded explanations, demanded justice, demanded to know how so many lives could be silenced under the guise of medicine. Yet Blackwell was nowhere to be found. When the storm cleared, the doctor had vanished, leaving behind empty chambers, scattered notes, and the hollow shell of his institution. Some claimed he fled in the night, disguised among the orderlies. Others whispered that he had buried himself in his own ritual, sealed alive in one of the coffins, offering his body to the earth he worshipped. No grave bearing his name was ever found, no body recovered, and so his absence became another silence, one that haunted the families more than his presence ever had. The sanatorium was sealed, its doors chained by authorities, but the damage had already spread beyond its walls. Investigators cataloged the evidence. Rows of coffins, each one marked with claw scratches, each one a testimony written in blood. Nurses, shaken into confession, spoke of the soundproof chambers, the plaster masks, the garden of restraints. Orderlies who once obeyed in fear now recounted in trembling voices how the doctor orchestrated every death with the precision of ritual. Their testimonies spilled into newspapers, shocking the nation. The image of Blackwell, once a hero of medicine, collapsed into that of a monster hiding behind a healer's face. For the families, the discovery brought no peace. They had been robbed not only of loved ones, but of the dignity of mourning. There had been no last words, no proper burials, only lies whispered by a man they had trusted. Some stood at the gates of the sanatorium for days, clutching bones or fragments of clothing as if waiting for an explanation that would never come. Others turned their grief into fury, demanding new laws, demanding that no institution be allowed to hide its patients away, without oversight. The storm had revealed not just bodies, but the fragility of trust between society and the ones who claimed to heal. Yet for all the horror unearthed, the deepest wound was that Blackwell himself escaped judgment. He was never tried, never forced to face the cries of the families, never made to account for the suffering he orchestrated. His silence remained, a void as chilling as the chambers he had built. People spoke of him in hushed tones, some calling him a demon, others insisting he was simply a man whose obsession rotted into evil. But no one could deny that his methods had scarred the land and left echoes in the soil. The flood had broken the silence, but it had not delivered justice. In the years that followed, the sanatorium rotted in disuse, its walls stained with mold, its gardens untended, its windows shattered by storms. Locals avoided the hill, claiming at night they heard muffled scratching from beneath the ground, as though the forgotten still clawed their way upward. Travelers who passed nearby said the air felt heavier there, the silence unnatural, the soil damp as if forever feeding on secrets. The collapse of silence had revealed the horror, but the horror had not yet released its grip. When the waters receded and the grounds of the sanatorium dried, the silence it had long held could no longer be restored. The unearthed coffins and etched names scarred more than soil. They scarred the conscience of a nation. For the first time, whispers of cruelty within asylums, long dismissed as rumor, found tangible proof. Blackwell's name, once printed in journals of medicine with reverence, was now spat in anger, his reputation drowned in mud and blood. But he was gone, his body never found, his shadow lingering as a reminder that evil can vanish before the law ever lays its hand upon it. Families demanded change. In Pennsylvania, petitions filled with shaking signatures pressed lawmakers to inspect institutions that had once been trusted without question. Journalists carried the story across state lines, their articles filled with images of claw-marked lids, of masks stained with dried flesh, of gardens blooming over shallow graves. Ministers preached sermons not of healing but of betrayal, warning congregations that mercy, when twisted by obsession, could become cruelty so deep it hollowed the very idea of compassion. Slowly, laws began to form. Committees were created to regulate asylums, to demand that no patient be hidden without oversight, that records be kept and burials marked. Yet even as these reforms spread, they came too late for the hundreds buried nameless beneath Blackwell's soil. A memorial was raised on the hill, funded by families who wanted some symbol of justice. A stone obelisk stood where the sanatorium once towered, engraved with the words, "For the forgotten, may silence never hide you again." Around it, the land was left untended, the soil considered sacred, though beneath its surface most coffins remained unmarked, their occupants lost to time and secrecy. Visitors left flowers at the base, but the act felt hollow, for without names the grief could never settle. Parents knelt without knowing if their child lay beneath that earth. Siblings wept over strangers' bones, believing them kin. The memorial was not closure. It was a wound carved into stone so that history could not pretend it had healed. Historians wrote of Blackwell as a man who embodied the dangers of unchecked power. They described how his calm smile and steady voice concealed a mind devoted not to healing, but to ritual. They studied his journals, recovered in fragments, where he wrote of silence as if it were a deity, where he measured breath as though it were currency, where he praised restraint and burial as offerings to the earth. These writings revealed a mind methodical, unflinching, and terrifyingly logical in its cruelty. He had not acted in sudden madness but in careful progression, each step of torture justified in his own reasoning, each death considered necessary for the purity he imagined. Evil, they concluded, had not raged within him like a storm. It had whispered like a prayer. The impact of his work lingered long after the sanatorium was gone. Other institutions across the country were forced to open their doors to inspection, yet in the shadows of reform, some continued their cruelty in quieter ways. Blackwell became a symbol of how easily society could be deceived by appearance. A doctor praised by presidents, a man trusted by senators, a healer celebrated by families, all while burying patients alive beneath his gardens. His story echoed in the halls of new hospitals, whispered as a warning to young doctors of what happens when science divorces itself from humanity, when progress is measured not by healing but by silence. For the survivors, there was no true healing. Those who escaped the garden of restraints, the chamber of hollow faces, or the soundproof walls carried scars that never closed. They were shunned as unstable, their testimony dismissed as delusions of madness, even though they spoke truths the flood later revealed. Many died in poverty, their stories lost in the noise of progress, their memories preserved only in the etched initials still faintly visible in stones salvaged from the sanatorium's ruins. They were the voices that society preferred to forget, for remembering meant facing complicity. The families who looked away, the patrons who smiled at dinner tables, the lawmakers who ignored whispers until it was too late. The greatest horror was not only in what Blackwell had done, but in how long he had been allowed to do it. His silence had been protected by wealth, by reputation, by the eagerness of society to believe in mercy without questioning its cost. Evil thrived not in shadows but in plain sight, dressed in white coats, polished shoes, and gentle reassurances. The sanatorium was proof that horror can grow inside institutions built for care, that cruelty can wear the mask of kindness until it becomes indistinguishable. Today, the hill is empty, the obelisk weathered by rain, the soil still unsettled. Travelers say the ground feels soft, that their footsteps sink deeper than expected, as if the earth itself remembers. Some claim that at night, when the wind cuts across the grass, it carries the sound of scratching, faint and steady, as though those buried without name still claw upward, refusing to be forgotten. Whether true or not, the legend lingers, warning each generation that silence is never harmless. The legacy of the buried voices is not only their deaths, but the lesson they leave behind. That evil often hides behind order, that cruelty thrives when people look away, that silence is not always peace, but sometimes the echo of lives crushed beneath ritual. And as historians ask how such horror could ever happen, the deeper question remains. What happens when society grows comfortable again, when vigilance fades, when trust blinds the eye to suffering? Could this happen again? The answer waits in silence.